Welcome and thank you to everyone who has joined us for today's panel discussion. My name is Grace Okafor, and I'm the Strategic Events Coordinator at the Institute for Ecological Civilization, or EcoCiv, a US-based international nonprofit. EcoCiv, in partnership with the British charity Reboot the Future, are excited to be hosting the program and series Conversations for a Life Economy. This project builds on Reboot the Future's 2020 Imaginal Conversations, a series of private discussions that examine our current way of life and seek to reimagine more positive and mutually beneficial relationships with ourselves, the world, and the environment. This project aims to bridge the golden rule and the core values that support a life economy to important initiatives and actions that are helping to actually bring it to life. Today, we are joined by three incredible panelists. First, we have Liberty Denman. She's a science communicator with a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology and Coastal Ecology from the University of Plymouth. Her desire to understand and protect marine life stems from a childhood spent in, on, and around the ocean, intrigued by everything within it. This fascination carried her into her academic life, where she now hopes to use her passion for communicating science to drive the protection and restoration of marine ecosystems. Her particular interest in sharks has taken her all over the world, working in Bimini, South Africa, and Malta, among other places. Liberty believes helping people understand the importance of sharks and other species to ecosystems will help their protection as well as resurface our connection with nature. Next, we have Daniel Deng, who serves as Chief of Party for the Monitoring and Evaluation Support Project of the U.S. Agency for International Development in South Sudan, which is implemented by Management Systems International, a Tetra Tech company. Daniel's history with humanitarian development began in Africa, where he acted as the Catholic Relief Service's youngest project manager in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, designing and managing a national justice and peace project. Civil War in 1998 shortened his assignment, and CRS switched him to Zimbabwe, where he worked across the region organizing for debt cancellation and fair trade. In 2000, Daniel participated in CRS Worldwide Justice Strategy. Over the next decade, Daniel's work pursued an inquiry. Can we script ecological and social responsibility into the DNA of global finance? And one of his current positions as community engagement lead for One Project, a nonprofit aimed at economic systems change, he is working on community partnerships for alternative economic systems. And finally, we have Stuart Foster, who is the Managing Director of Institutional Banking and Depository Services at RBS International. This includes NatWest Trustee and Depository Services, the largest fully independent trustee and depository provider in the UK. Among his many titles, he sits on the RBS International Executive Committee and is their Senior Responsible Officer for Climate Strategy, as well as serving as the executive sponsor for the RBS International Talent Academy. Stuart formerly served as Managing Director of Large Corporate and Sectors Businesses, where he was accountable for sector strategy and risk appetite across the commercial bank, with responsible for a number of sectors. Finally, Stuart is an associate of the Chartered Institute of Bankers and holds a non-executive director role for the Big Society Capital, where he also serves as a UK bank shareholder representative and a member of Board Risk and Audit Committee. I'm going to now transition the space for Philip, our EcoCiv's president.
Thanks very much, Grace, and welcome, Liberty, Daniel, and Stuart. The three of you are visionary leaders who are working for the kinds of changes that are necessary, and in a time that it's clear in your careers calls for urgent and radical action. I think what might be most valuable for the audience is to get to know you as people a little bit. What fuels you? What kind of experiences have led you to make the incredible commitments that you've made in your careers and to launch the initiatives that you're involved in? And what are the values that drive that process? So maybe you'll allow me to begin on a slightly more personal level and to ask you, let me start with Liberty, to ask you some experience, something in the world that has caused you to live in a different way. I mean, Liberty, everybody who knows you knows that sharks are at the center of your life. In fact, what is that on your neck? From here, it looks like a shark.
Yes, it is a hammerhead shark. I got it. I actually got it in South Africa. I was diving with a different species at the time, but I have been lucky enough to dive with them as well, which was probably the experience in which you're going to want to hear about, which is...
Well, I just want to ask you, have you ever had a close face-to-face encounter with a shark? I mean, they're sort of large, aren't they?
Yeah, massive. Well, species dependent, but massive. And I've had a lot. I've been really privileged and I've been able to see them in all over the world.
Tell us about a time you've looked face into the eyes of a shark under the water.
Bimini is possibly the most memorable with the hammerhead shark. So I was free diving at the time, so you don't have any oxygen tanks or anything, you're just diving. And I couldn't actually equalize at the time. So I had to, I wasn't really thinking about the sharks, even though I knew I was surrounded by them. And I just dived down and I tried to just focus on my breathing. And as I looked around, this massive hammerhead was swimming towards me. She was about 3.5 meters. And any shark, when they look at you, you can really see, you can see their eyes and you can notice them acknowledge you, but it's so much more pronounced with a hammerhead because they've got their eyes on either side of their head. So when they're looking, you can see their head swinging around to acknowledge you. And she circled me and I just was so fixated on her eyes. I was obsessed. And she circled me once and just swam off, to the point where I'd entirely forgotten that I was supposed to be breathing and I needed to breathe. And it wasn't until she'd swum away that I'd actually realized that I needed some oxygen, had to dart to the surface, because it was the most mesmerizing experience.
That's incredible. How has that formed you? None of the rest of us, and probably nobody listening right now, has looked, so close into the eyes of a hammerhead shark, which puts you close to her mouth, I'm assuming.
It does. That is at the pointy end, I can confirm.
So how is that a transformative experience? How are you different from having had those kinds of experiences?
It's just an appreciation. It's an appreciation for something that's unknown to so many people. And that comes across all sorts of things and all topics. When you take something that might have fear attached to it or misunderstanding, and you really just embrace the moment and appreciate it for what it is, and not what you think it might be, not what you think it might be able to do, but what it actually is and the moment that's happening right then, it's quite freeing, and it's an appreciation. They're not mindless killers. They're just other creatures that have evolved for a lot more years than us, and they're incredible.
That's fantastic. Let me ask Stuart, and I know that you're an athlete and a very serious runner, and that means you probably spend more time in the outdoors than most of us do, surrounded by the beautiful countryside of Kent, the rolling hills. Can you describe the space of the everyday run for you as an athlete? What is that as a space, an inner transformative space?
Well, thanks, Ben. I think athlete is probably too strong a word, but I like to keep fit and certainly enjoy the outside space. Running is massively important to my well-being, actually. So the love of the outdoors, I would say I'm at my calmest and most thoughtful when I'm outside enjoying a run in the countryside and embracing nature. We are very fortunate to live in a rural setting where there's woods and there's hills and there's deer and other animals, and you can get into a space of thoughtfulness where actually you can provide a level of calmness to the challenges that you face in your professional life, and you get a clarity that is not there when I'm sitting at my desk as I am now. So I just think more clearly. So it really helps me in terms of my day job and therefore my well-being.
What's different about the outdoors, about being in nature? Would you have the same feeling on a treadmill?
No, it's got to be outside. And I know others might have a different view on that, but for me personally, being outside in any element, whether it's rain, snow, shine, wind, being outside and just being there where nobody can really interfere, it's just you and just your own thoughts, and there's a calmness and a collectiveness about, okay, what are the issues that I need to work through, and it does genuinely for me create a different perspective that allows me to be more productive in the workplace, and I genuinely believe that.
That's fantastic. Daniel, I know that in decades of your international work, issues of justice have stood right at the center. It makes me wonder whether there was, in the early part of your life, stay in Sudan, friendships or connections or things that you saw or things that happened to family members that set you on that path. Is it too personal to ask? What were some of those one or two really early formative experiences that have fueled your work?
No, it's not too personal to ask. In fact, I appreciate the question. I think it's a meaningful question. Much of who we are is probably defined through the relationships that we have. And so I can look back on my life in that respect. And it does take me right back to the beginning in the sense of the type of friendships that I naturally formed. My father likes to say that from before I could even speak, I was always siding with the underdog. And I think that has remained with me throughout. I can think of one time, I was born in Washington, D.C., but we returned pretty quickly to the Sudan where my father is from. My mother's an American woman. And at that time, he was working in government. He was actually a minister in the Sudan government. So we had a big ministerial house. And on the side of the house was a tin shack, a one-room tin shack that was inhabited by someone who became an informal kind of caretaker of the house. And he had 11 children in that one-room shack. And his son's name was Adam, one of the sons. And he became my best friend. And, you know, we were together all of the time. And that's just been kind of a motif in my life. You know, I don't know if it's something that I consciously have sought out or it's something that I was just born with, but the idea of inequity doesn't sit well with me. And so I've always sought to bridge that in whatever way I can. And that's brought me also into my professional work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It also suggests a focus on that justice is not an impersonal principle, but it has to do with actual lived relationships. Has that molded your work with Catholic Relief Services and other organizations?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? We've never talked about that before, actually.
The
role
justice
of that
side of it, the justice side of it.
Justice.
The justice side of it, if I still use this lens of relationships, I would say that Adam wasn't so much about justice. I wasn't even conscious at that time of those considerations. It was just natural for Adam and I to be friends. But in hindsight, you start seeing patterns in your life. But in terms of the first conscious association of injustice, I remember being in Sudan. This was a time when things were falling apart. The war between the South started in 1983. It was a new chapter of an old war and an old conflict. And we happen to come from an area that is highly affected by that conflict on the border between the two countries. In fact, it's an area probably of the highest displacement in the world over the longest period of time. And the community still to this day is displaced between these two rival countries. And at that time, militias were sent into the area for these scorched earth campaigns, which basically means to rid the land of the people. And I had one uncle whose name was Arop, who was deaf. And he was actually tending his fields in the village. And although others could hear the militias as they approached, he couldn't. And so he didn't manage to take refuge, and they killed him in the field. And I remember the uncles talking about that. I was only maybe 5 years old, but that was singed into my consciousness as the first real case of injustice that motivated me to, at that time, it just made me feel something. Mm-hmm. And that feeling, I think, is what later motivated me to address injustice through my work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's fantastic. Let's move to the values that drive your work. And again, Liberty, could I start with you? If you were trying to put words on the sorts of values that guide, what would how would you describe it?
I would say listening and understanding. So I think for all of the things that, like, even you've just talked about, Daniel, with the injustice or lack of education or appreciation, all of it comes from a lack of understanding and desire to appreciate where the other person's coming from. And whatever that may be. And in the scientific community, it can be particularly painful to listen to something that, a particular scientist may have dedicated their whole life to, and then someone butchers it and you see an awful Facebook post about someone, completely misinterpreting it, going off on a total limb. And you think, hold on, that this was such a particularly important topic and it's just gone completely off the rails. But there's been no appreciation for why that person may have entirely misunderstood what you've said, or if there's no listening and no appreciation for what the other person is saying and no desire to understand where both people are coming from, you're going to fall short in the middle. And again, that applies to all sorts of topics and issues, environmental, social, political. It applies to so many different things. And so I think carrying the value of wanting to listen and understand other people is really important throughout any professional or non-professional environment, really.
I have to ask you directly about nature, the values of nature. You have a particular love for blue nature, and I think that's not something that everyone shares and understands. Liberty, could you describe a little bit of what it is to live with that value at the center of your life and action?
Yeah, I think it's about recognized appreciation. So something that really gets me and sort of breaks my heart when I listen to political or economic talk is that the environment's always secondhand to that. And we are so disconnected from nature that we forget that we rely on it entirely. We simply cannot survive without it. I mean, there's the old quote that I think was from a specific Native American, but I couldn't quote correctly. But they say, it's only when we've eaten the last fish and the last river's been dried up that we realize we can't eat money. And it has to be taken into consideration now. Otherwise, well, when will we learn? And I'm so grateful, and I'm very lucky that I've grown up in an area where I have been able to experience. I grew up 2 minutes from the beach. I spent my childhood in, on, and around it. And I mean, now I'm slap bang in the middle of the forest. I've been able and been lucky enough to appreciate all of these things, and I therefore I value it because I can see the direct value to it in my life. I'm so connected to it. But I can understand how someone who has grown up, not near the sea or in the middle of a city or wherever that may be, that doesn't hold that direct value because they don't see it. You protect what you love and you love what you see and what you experience. So if you haven't experienced that, you're not going to have that same level of appreciation. And I think we really need to acknowledge how important it is to us as people, as a species.
That's beautifully put. With Daniel, we were talking about the role of relationships and values. And I wonder, Stuart, if you can think of a person or a situation or something that's influenced the values that underscore your work in leadership.
Yeah, I think as we were discussing the other day, Philip, I think the person that had the most influence on me was probably my university professor, who took me as a wet behind the ears boy with a set of values clearly around social mobility, fairness, doing the right thing, and turned me into somebody who could think and challenge and believe in themselves, so actually you can make a difference. And so that individual, Professor Pettigrew up at St Andrews, we all have people that influence us hugely, encourage me to challenge and think hard about, okay, how do you really do the right thing and what can you actually influence, whether it's in the world of academia or subsequently in the world of business. I think that person gave me the confidence and the intellectual dexterity to think in a way that previously I hadn't thought of, even though I had the same set of values. It sort of allowed those values to flourish into something that could have an impact.
Does it take a firm hold on an inner sense of values to bring about institutional change? The banking sector is not famous for being loving high risk, and change in institutions is hard. What makes it possible to be transformative within major institutions?
Really interesting question, and one where a financial institution, a financial service, any company should serve the customers, the society it's in, and they should always remember that's its role, that's its core role, and that's no different for a bank. And actually, fundamentally, a bank such as NatWest Group, we are there to serve our communities, our individuals, to do the right thing in every aspect. And you can only do that if you have a bunch of people that really believe that is the case. So Alison Rose, our chief exec of 2 years, reset that with a purpose strategy 2 years ago. And we partnered with an outfit called Blueprint for business, which you'll have heard of, Philip. And effectively, what that drives is a purposeful strategy. Yes, a commercial one, but one that is rooted in doing the right thing, whether it's colleagues, suppliers, customers, the wider world, and that manifests itself in a series of actions, strategic actions that make a real difference to climate, social issues, diversity. Yes, based in with the premise that if you do the right thing and you serve the society in which you're there, fundamentally you'll get rewarded by having more customers because people want to bank with you and work for you because you're doing the right thing. And this all stems into the DNA of each individual. You have to have the right motivation to work for a firm such as NatWest and others, because if you don't, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, I love the connection from the institutional change back to the DNA of individuals. Daniel, you reflected a lot on that. I have no more specific prompt than how would you formulate the core values that have led to your decades-long international work?
Yeah, I do agree that eventually, if I was to go to the conclusion, it is about anchoring oneself within. Injustice is kind of a lens that forces you or results from you looking outward at systems and structures outside of yourself that you'd like to see changed. And I think the long journey of learning in life kind of brings you back to that fundamental change starts within. So I would say that I'd agree with Stuart about anchoring within. Also, values seem in my life to constellate. There's a constellation of values that seem highly connected that I would speak to. The first is the value of justice, also closely relates to the value of peace. And there's that big question of what comes first, justice or peace. And I've had a lot of experience in my work and in my life in conflict situations. And that's always the question. To what extent do we pursue justice? And to what extent do we pursue peace? And how can we marry the two? There's others that also occur to me. And some of these are deeply ecologically rooted. I was trying to figure out what are universal values? What can we all buy into, regardless of our political, our religious, our cultural, what are the universal values? And I looked to the sun and the movement of the sun, and I said, in that eastern horizon, when you see the sun rise and it kind of breaks over with that first point of light, it's like everything is united. And unity is such a beautiful value to try to pursue in life, your relationships with others, social cohesion. A lot of my work has been around that, building solidarity amongst people who have differences and are in conflict. At the other side of the sun's journey, it's setting, the setting sun, where everything is done, everything has already happened, and that looking back on the day, and I think that speaks to even what Liberty was saying in terms of appreciation and understanding. I call it knowledge, a real respect for knowledge of one another. And so one of my kind of dialectics is this unity, knowledge. And then the other two are self-reliance, because in the midst of being united, people need to feel like they're self-determining, and building that sense of being able to provide for yourself and being able to respond independently to situations. And the last one is just healing, healing. And I think that takes us that we're all, from the time we are born, at first scream, it's a traumatic experience being born, both for the mother and for the child. And we remain in conditions of stress and shock, requiring resilience. And so we all are on a healing journey from day one. And I think that takes us back to what both of my colleagues here speak to, is just nature and how nature can help with that.
Beautiful. Thanks. Let's make a big shift in how we're doing our conversation. We think of the flow from sort of contemplation to action, inner experience, core values, action. Kim Pullman starts from the most general principle that we really ought to treat ourselves and the world the way that we'd like to be treated, or what the Western traditions call the golden rule. I'd love to really concentrate in on the action side, but also to change our format a little bit and invite one of you to mention an action that you either are involved in, leadership initiative or one that you would like to launch, and have the other two panelists become the questioners and the commentators rather than me. Liberty, are you willing to be the guinea pig for a different sort of kind of conversation? What I'd like to ask you to do is to describe the project that you would love to initiate, and if you're successful beyond your wildest dreams in the next 20 years, what that initiative will look like, and see where it takes Stuart and Daniel and what they want to ask and where they want to push or probe or question. Would you be willing to start?
Sure. So many things. I'm going to try and compartmentalize that into something that's going to make sense in a
just give us like
coherent manner.
Just at the beginning, just in a minute. What is the core thing that the initiative that you're launching?
I would love to implement something that, so again, like sort of what you were touching on, Daniel, as well as like the knowledge side of things. Some of the biggest problems we're facing ecologically is because of a lack of that, and also a lack of appreciation, as I was saying before. I would love to have two separate things. So my biggest passion is documentaries. I'd love to go into presenting, and because it's got such a wide target audience, right? Anyone will look at a pretty picture. It doesn't matter what background you come from. Pretty pictures are nice to look at. So having something that can invite the viewer to see all the different things that are going on, whether it's as far away as, you know, Antarctica or as close as on your coastline with fighting and enemies, whatever it may be. But then also having a facility whereby people from all different backgrounds, whether it be corporate, kids from schools, wherever it may be, where people can come and actually experience nature in any different way they want it to be. Could be passive, could be active, and just engage with it to help reconnect, because I really believe that reconnecting with nature is going to be the start of our solution in helping the planet and how we're going to progress as a species, hopefully with everything else in a cyclical manner. So I think that's two things. I'd want to basically create a hub, is what I'm saying, create a hub of information whereby you can see it from far away, or you can experience it in person from any background with any experience. And I think that would be such a powerful starting point to unite people. Again, like you were saying, we need to, you know, differences need to be put aside for progression to actually be made. And I think that's an amazing shared experience in a positive way, is a great way to actually do that. So I think, yeah, that's what I'd like, I think.
Liberty, can I ask a question? I'm fascinated by everything you've said so far around sharks and the deep blue sea. But in terms of success, I mean, clearly we're facing a crisis of biodiversity in the blue oceans and as well as on land. And what you're describing there is obviously the important tool of education, which is super critical to everything to affect change. Is there a more dramatic action that needs to be had alongside, in parallel to education, to create the change that you want?
Absolutely. So I feel like with education, it often implies you're talking to kids, which obviously is a great start. Kids are the future, but like you said, we need a lot of this change right now. And that comes in the form of adults. People, you know, everyone comes from such different backgrounds. No one's going to be an expert in anything. And I think that education can very much be at the level of CEOs of massive corporates. I mean, something that actually, I mean, this is going a bit deeper here, but I've recently saw an interview with the CEO of Shell and another activist. And I have to say, it made me a little bit upset, because it seemed to me personally a bit like a wasted opportunity. So I totally understand how painful it must be as an environmentalist to have to sit and have that conversation, because the CEO of Shell, as the CEO and of many other corporates that are drivers of these problems, it's very painful to have that conversation and keep your cool. But she didn't let him speak, and she asked questions and then talked over him and then didn't want to share the stage. And while I said I really understand that and I empathize with that, it was a wasted opportunity. He's the CEO of Shell. He almost single-handedly has the tools and the ability to make huge change for biodiversity and ultimately us. And so I just asking questions and answering them without beating about the bush and being up front. We do need change. We need it now. And it's going to have to happen on so many different levels. Political, absolutely. A little bit painful to watch for things like COP26. I know a lot of people are quite disappointed after that. But yeah, also taking it into the corporate world. A lot of environmentalists, again, understandably don't want to push into that realm because they think, oh, it's, it's them and us. That's not how this works. If we want to actually move forwards and progress, we need to build bridges between those worlds. And like I said, that education needs to go to people of all fields, and it's not just going to be a talking to a kids kind of thing. It can go across many different fields.
I couldn't agree more. And in my world, in our institution, everyone's all the senior leaders are undertaking the Cambridge Sustainability Institute course degree, which is, not the banking, as well as the banking degree, obviously, but but actually a lot of focus and education and development is about completely non-banking aspects and how you wield the two together to create that two change. You only really do it for education, though, don't you? And again, having a set of leaders that believe and are motivated to create change is where you start. And if that can be replicated in the Shells and other institutions, you create an interesting interface.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really awesome as well, that's being something that's integrated.
Can I jump in? Also, just building on what I'm hearing, I think that question of the CEO and the activist and the dialogue that they were having and what that means in terms of, and I'm going to use the word transformation because we talked about values before. To me, that kind of sits in the heart of that constellation is transformation. We're all seeking to transform in our own personal lives. We want to transform our relationships to be better, transform our bodies to be stronger, transform the world to be happier. So transformation is a big part of the agenda. And yet you have these entrenched systems and people who work within them and represent them. And then you have those who are on the other side trying as their vocation to change these very systems. And the question is, what is the power of that handshake between the activist and the executive? Is there really promise in that, or are we wasting our time? Are people set in their ways, or is it best that we just kind of rage against the machine? You know what I mean? Realizing that this is a zero-sum game. One is going to win, one is going to lose. Is that the future of activism, or is that dialogue, that genuine listening, appreciating across lines and finding a meeting point? Is that the future of it? What is your opinion, either one of you?
Perhaps
I've been leading. You go ahead.
I'll perhaps respond to that, Daniel. I think it's a great observation. I think two things for me. I think firstly, the severity and the global nature of the challenges that we all face will only be solved by partnership of different groups, of politicians, regulators, individuals, consumers, corporates. The only tech firms. The only way we're going to solve this is to work together across boundaries, and I think that is happening. I think in the corporate world and the financial institution world, I sense a real sea change in the last number of years, where yes, there'll be some firms that are greenwashing, inverted commas, but most are not. I think it's going into the heart of the way they do business, because most firms. And I certainly like to think that NatWest is leading by example here, but I think there's a spectrum, obviously, of where individual firms are on a journey, understand that without doing this, they will effectively not have a commercial future. In that, that you should be doing it for the right reasons. The inner motivation that we've talked about, and I think there's a number of great examples around that, whether that's Unilever or NatWest or other firms that genuinely believe. There'll be others, though, that will have the cold-headed, actually, you won't have a commercial future unless you do this correctly. And I truly believe that what you've seen in the last few years is a complete sea change in the way corporates and institutions are looking at ESG, environmental, social and governance issues more broadly, and are trying their hardest to work out how they embed that in their business models. That can only be a good thing. And the more if you ally that with people's motivations, inner motivations, more of those type of individuals in senior leadership positions in all corporates, you have the ability to change the system and put pressure on politicians.
I'm curious, Liberty, what direction you were going to go with Daniel's question.
I mean, I was going to say, first of all, I totally agree with Stuart in terms of that, you have to have these partnerships. You're not going to get anywhere by banging on the glass from the other side. You have to be in the room to discuss it. And I think that's really important. I think for me, it's about asking those questions that mean you can't greenwash, because it does happen with most big corporates in quite a lot of ways in some form have done an element of greenwashing. It happens in the fast fashion industry, anywhere you look, it's very easy to do because business on that scale is so difficult to change. And I think for me, it's about asking those questions that almost mean that can't happen. I mean, first, in that instance, I'd have to ask, who's doing your environmental impact assessments? I'd love to know. That's got to be an in-house job. But aside from that, I'd have just so many different questions to understand where he's coming from, because I can't possibly engage in conversation with him or the large CEO of a corporate that's doing a similar thing without understanding where he's possibly coming from. So I'd want to know, where do you see the future of, in this case, Shell in 5 and 10 years? Do you actually see you moving away entirely from fossil fuels? It's a finite resource, right? Where are you going to go after this? There's only so much room you've got. Where do you think the room for improvement is, and how on earth you've got all these people, all these different activist groups and pressure to do the right thing and move in a more sustainable way. But how are you actually going to do that? There's no point in just saying, oh, we'd love to do this. It's great, blah, blah, blah. What are you actually going to do? Where are you going to start within your business? Doesn't matter how small it is. Where are you going to start to actually implement that change? And I think I'd also love to know I'd ask, do you appreciate and acknowledge how much power you have personally to impact the environment and ultimately us? Do you appreciate how much control you have over the natural world with the decision you may or may not make? And how do you think you can move forwards with that, knowing that if you really acknowledge that, how can you move forwards to better yourself and your company and ultimately the planet? Because if he doesn't,
for Stuart to talk about the things that he and his colleagues are doing. But before we leave Liberty, I want to do something I have never done before, to ask Stuart and Daniel for one piece of advice you might give this emerging leader as she heads into a career of making documentaries, presumably focused on sharks and similar species, and to launch educational programs that are transformative. What is one, if you just had a sentence or two to say, a word that you've learned from your experience that will make her more successful in this project, what would you say?
I think Liberty needs any advice, but the partnership. Yeah, I think that she's completely correct. I think listening to all stakeholders and partnership and wielding that together to create a clear plan of action would be my piece of advice. I think we all need to do that.
I think mine would be first of all to just appreciate this notion of asking powerful questions as the kind of modus operandi in engaging with across these lines and trying to bring people to a common vision that could support such coalition building, right? And I would say I don't have a piece of advice, but I do have an appeal that she would hold a certain question in mind and come back to me at a certain point and tell me what she's found out or learned. And the question is, if our vision is the integrity of the environment and nature and our connection to it, does your vision of that learning space, that kind of, I almost imagine as you're talking, a living learning environment where we can have kind of this immersive multimedia experience that will just open our minds to what's possible, right, in terms of renewing our relationship with nature. Do you see it from a consciousness standpoint, where there's natural reserves that are untouched and we have our kind of mechanical cities where we live and we just make sure that we, chop up space so that both exist? Or do you see a true integration of human habitat and technology and nature where the two can become seamless in your vision of that living and learning environment? That would be my appeal to you, is hold that question in mind and get back to me.
That's an awesome question. And I want to broadcast this conversation when it happens in 10 years. Stuart, can you take just a few minutes to describe, say, one initiative that you and your colleagues are involved in that you think has the ability to be transformative, to be scaled by other institutions and to serve as a model for the crucial role of finance in the transition to a sustainable life economy?
Yeah, I think, whilst COP26, you're right, Liberty sort of fell short in many areas. I think the one positive area that did come out was Mark Carney and others describing how private finance, if used correctly, can be quite a lever for change, and probably in a faster way than maybe, dare I say, governments and regulators. And the reason I think is two or three key reasons. Firstly, a financial institution serves its society, so there's the education aspect of we are there to address concerns and to provide a plan of actions for individuals and small companies to do the right thing in terms of a transition. That this is quite complicated. If you're sitting there as a hairdresser, as an agricultural firm, people haven't got the time, or they want to do the right thing, but they're not sure how to. So the role of a financial institution to advise, support, then provide the ideas of how is really important. More bluntly, financial firms or asset managers more broadly can direct capital and liquidity to those entities that doing the right thing and take it away from those that don't. And it's a fairly blunt lever, and within that there's a complex grey area of supporting firms that are doing the right thing and have a clear transition plan. That's really, really important, and again, to my first point, a really crucial element of a financial institution to support people to do the right thing. But ultimately we can direct capital away from those areas that are not, and again, NatWest has been a front runner in doing that in some of the more heavily laden fossil fuel areas. And then finally, we can set ambitious targets of our own, right? So Alison Rose, our chief exec, has effectively said our Scope 3 emissions will be halved by 2030. So that's effectively saying we will be a commercial outfit and lend more money, but we will do it in the right way whilst cutting our carbon emissions to our clients' carbon emissions by half in 10 years. And obviously, to your point, Liberty, this is all externally assured and ensure there's no aspect of greenwashing at all. But these are going to be difficult decisions that will then generate innovation, partnerships, solutions to try and help companies do the right thing and encourage us to lend capital to those companies that are doing the right thing. So I think there's a very bold vision. We don't have all the answers. We need to work with partners to get the answers to allow us to fulfill those objectives. But Alison has set the bold vision that I hope others will follow.
Fantastic. Let me see where Daniel and Liberty want to take that with questions or comments.
I'll ask Stuart a question that I'm just fascinated by, and I would ask him to kindly, in answering, remove the hat of where he's presently situated, but maintain all that knowledge in his head, and in his body and the experiences when he answers the question. If we're looking for kind of transformational coalitions, and let's call it around new development paradigms, new ways of developing our natural resources, our living environments, our industries. Do you see the greater potential coming from the formal finance sector the banking sector that you're most familiar with? Or do you see the introduction of blockchain and decentralized finance and that whole world, which is starting to grow and we don't know much about it, but obviously seems like it's not going anywhere and it's only getting bigger? How do you see, one, the comparative advantages of these two types of finance to fuel transformation? And also, can they come together and operate together based on your perspective?
It's a great question. And I think the answer is they will all have a part to play. I think the key underpinning aspect, actually, in my view, is data and transparency and measurement. So we all have a common view of who or what is doing the right thing. So therefore you individuals and governments can choose to buy products or services or from companies that are doing the right thing or apply pressure to governments. I think that will require partnerships with big tech firms, any outfits that have the data, and it needs a level of consistency that needs to be driven by the UN, I would suggest. So we have one clear mechanism and understanding, a bit like financial accounting, right? There's one clear international standard for financial accounting. We don't have that for ESG, inverted commas. So therefore you have an imperfect market, in my view. So how you create that perfect market and allow us all to make choices that are informed, I think that's the biggest lever for change. Because if you had that clarity, I think the world would change very, very quickly on all aspects, both the E, the S and the G. And I know there's a lot of different conversations going on about that. Rewired Earth is one that I'm aware of and involved with, how you create that transparency that will allow us all to make better decisions.
Like you're saying, Stuart, finance obviously has so much potential to be great and achieve things a lot faster than perhaps governments and policy has the ability or desire to do. Do you think there's any, with the rate of transformative change, it has the potential to be great? Do you think there's any potential for it to have any sort of flaws, or if it to go in the wrong direction with perhaps wrong investments or people moving or organizations moving potentially in the wrong direction?
I think, so I think, by the way, I'll caveat my earlier statement, I think governments and regulators are absolutely crucial. They need to play their part, and otherwise the finance will work. But I think there is absolutely there is a danger. I think this is a personal view. I don't want companies to be put off doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing by being almost a fear factor of, I could start to feel it coming, of certain institutions worried about, are they ESG, where they're at the start of a journey of actually trying to do the right thing, and maybe they've not got the right data that underpins it, and in 2 years' time, with the benefit of hindsight, they look bad, where actually they've tried to do the right thing. So I think there's a balance to be struck in the system to encourage the right behaviours, knowing that collectively we might not have the whole answer, and we're all learning as we go along. But my personal view is, we should encourage those behaviours and innovations and thought processes. Definitely. Because that's the way you'll affect change. Because if everyone's too scared to make an act, then we're not going to get anywhere. If we're trying to get 100% perfection, we could be here having this conversation in 20 years' time, rather than learning as we try.
Totally agree.
Let me ask a question. What's the biggest risk that you and other innovators in the financial sector face? What keeps you awake at night? The potential transformative power of what you and your colleagues are engaged in is so obvious. What worries you? There's exposure. This is not a simple task in any way.
No, I think, to be honest, the opportunity is enormous for every, to do the right thing, to effect real change, to be commercially successful. Actually, if you really mean it, I think that will come with it in parallel. I think that the challenge is, to me, is data, and ensuring we have a common data set to make clear decisions with. We're getting, we're working really hard on that, and working with partners to ensure that we have a clear set of data that we can make decisions with, and others can make decisions with. I think it's a much broader discussion for society globally of how you get that common set of data to allow people to make informed decisions, because it is complicated for individuals to make decisions.
I'd like to, as we get into the closing period of the show, invite Daniel to share something of the various concrete work you're involved in multiple sectors and countries. Is there a dream project, something that if you were able to bring it about while you're still able to be active and strong, that would feel like it was an enduring contribution? What would you single out of all your work, this sort of dream project? It may be too personal, but that's the question I want to ask.
First, that answer picking up on where Stuart left off in terms of data and the importance of data. And I would definitely concur with that and say, in addition, the metrics that we use to make sense of the data is important. Data can lead to different conclusions based on the analytics, right? And what that means is, what do we value? Because that's what we'll measure. And in terms of that, my work has been really focused on changing the metrics that we use to measure development success, from, say, the GDP model, literally where you could be destroying the environment, turning it into money and putting it in the hands of one person. And the GDP would say, you did a damn good job, excuse my language, you did, congratulations, you are the best economic performer out there. So we've inverted that, and we look more at resilience as the metric. And the interesting thing about resilience, okay, it's jargon on the one hand, but if you really unpack it, what is it doing? It's forcing us to look within and looking at those internal capacities for whatever the self is that we're talking about. If it's Liberty, if it's Stuart, it's Daniel, these are the internal capacities that allow us to cope with shock. But you can also look at it at the level of a village. You can look at it at the level of a city. You can look at it at the level of a country, a system, an institution. It internalizes the view to the capacities that have to be strengthened. And I think from a metric standpoint, that's really important, that we start measuring resilience, our ability to respond to turbulence, to changing scenarios, to shocks, to stresses. And the more that we adopt a common language around that, the more those coalitions can be easily facilitated. My dream project would be to take that concept of measurement and apply it to a model village, and have this model village both a speculative design challenge around value chain with all these metrics. How do we optimize for that using finance? Talking to Stuart about how we can get the finance in, and how do we build into it the indigenous wisdom of harmony and balance with nature. So we'll be asking Liberty also to consult on this project, right? And we have this model village that is both speculative on a computer, but also built out as a living and learning environment, similar to what Liberty shared with us before, and really be able to study the value chains, the governance systems, the economics, and design an alternative, and to the extent that that's possible, to then introduce how it could be adapted to the real world out there of cities and countries and banks and partnerships and coalitions. That would be my dream project.
I'd love to just turn right to Liberty and then Stuart to say, what is something that moves you or draws you about what Daniel's describing? What's something that's transformative that you would love to see scaled and made fundamental?
I was just going to say, it's so nice to hear you talk about the word resilience and having that referred to from a people perspective, because from a biological perspective, resilience is a term used to talk about how an ecosystem can survive disturbance. So, an ecosystem that has a really high biodiversity on a genetic and a species level has a much higher chance of surviving any kind of disturbance, because there's more species or more genetics to fill a niche and do a role and keep that ecosystem functioning. And I've never actually contemplated it from a human perspective before. And to see that really obvious link there and how that's relevant was just actually really refreshing, because it makes so much sense.
Philip, I'll add to that. I think transformative change, I'll be quite grandiose. I want to be part of a movement that creates genuine system change, and I know this is going to be difficult and it's going to take a long time, but it feels like momentum is building. Needs to build quicker, needs to be faster. But I think being part of an institution that's at the forefront of genuine change and create a movement that will just snowball, I think will be highly rewarding. So it does feel like we have an opportunity, but we need to deliver on it, both as an institution, but as a society.
I know what question is, it feels like the right question to ask at this discussion of values for a life economy. All three of you are change makers. You want your work to have the sort of long-term impact that leads to a society that's just, that's sustainable, what we call an ecologically based civilization. If you had to single out one principle that leads to change, one thing that, whether by inspiring or teaching or whatever framework you want to give it, what's that one principle? Daniel Liberty Stuart, what's a principle that you would say, I hope others who seek to bring about change can apply this principle because it's key to our success?
I think it would be the principle of deep, courageous listening.
And paired with that understanding, I think. Between those two, you can't necessarily, one without the other might not work so well, but those two things paired together, a lot of potential there.
Liberty, what's the center of understanding? What makes understanding possible?
Deep listening.
Touché.
And actually building on that, I would say doing the right thing. And that effectively means listening and understanding from a variety of stakeholders that will inform your actions. So actually the same answer.
Mm-hmm. This has been one of the most inspiring of the discussions that we've been involved in over the last months with Reboot the Future and Kim Pullman. Your activism, your knowledge, your ability to listen and understand each other's work, even though it's vastly different, is a model of the things that you said. You modeled in your actions what you've asked us to pursue in ours. And I found it a deep learning experience as well as immensely inspiring. Thank you, Liberty. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to join us. And with that, let me please hand off to our leader, Grace Okafor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to all the attendees watching globally. It's our hope that you all will continue in this journey of reflective conversations and that the insights of these programs inspire you to take action towards a just and sustainable future. We encourage you to follow this project by signing up to both the EcoCiv and Reboot the Future mailing lists found on our websites, as well as our organization's social medias for updates on our next event. Thank you so much to Liberty, Daniel, and Stuart for such an amazing conversation and a great way to close out 2021. Thank you all for tuning in again. Have a great day.